One of the most powerful armies in the world was falling apart in a frozen marsh, and nobody could explain how it had happened so fast. The men running through that marsh in January of 1475 were not inexperienced soldiers. They were not conscripts pulled from farms and handed weapons they did not know how to use. These were soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, men who had stood at the walls of Constantinople and watched those walls fall, men who had fought in Serbia, in Bosnia, in Wallachia, who had marched through the ruins of kingdoms and come out the other side still standing. The most battle-hardened fighting force in the world at that moment in history. And they were in full collapse. Arrows were coming from directions no one could identify. The fog was so thick that a man could not see 10 steps ahead of him, and the screams filling that fog were coming from every direction at once. The ground had stopped being ground. It was cold mud and blood, and the bodies of men who had been hours earlier part of a disciplined formation. Horses were gone. Officers were gone. The entire structure of command that had held this army together across thousands of miles of campaigning had dissolved in a single valley that none of their maps had warned them about. And the man responsible for all of it was not leading a larger army. He was not a great sultan with the resources of a continent behind him. He was the ruler of a small principality that most of the world had barely heard of, commanding a force roughly half the size of the one he had just broken. His name was Stephen III of Moldavia, and this is the story of how he did it. Before we go any further, if you find this kind of history worth your time, please take a moment to like this video and drop a comment below. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about stories like this one, and it means more than you might think. Now let us go back to where this all truly began. To understand what happened at Vaslui, you first need to understand the weight of the Ottoman Empire in the year 1474. This was not an empire still finding its footing. This was not a rising power testing its reach. By the mid-1470s, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II was the dominant force in its known world, and Mehmed himself was something genuinely rare in history. A ruler who matched personal ambition with genuine military genius and had the resources and loyalty to act on both. He had taken Constantinople in 1453. He was 21 years old when he did it. The city that had stood for 1,000 years as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire fell in 53 days of siege, and when it did, the reverberations reached every court in Europe and every throne in the Islamic world. Mehmed did not simply conquer a city, he ended an era. He closed a chapter of history that everyone had assumed would remain open indefinitely, and in doing so he announced that the Ottoman Empire was no longer one power among many. It was the power, the one that set the terms. In the years after Constantinople, Mehmed had not slowed. He campaigned almost without interruption. Serbia fell, the despotate of the Morea fell, Bosnia fell, Trebizond, the last surviving fragment of the Byzantine world, fell in 1461. By the late 1460s, the Ottomans had absorbed or neutralized virtually every Christian state in the Balkans, and Mehmed was already looking east, where the Karamanid dynasty in Anatolia and the Akkoyunlu Confederation under Uzun Hasan posed the most credible remaining threats to his dominance. The campaign against Uzun Hasan concluded decisively at the Battle of Otlubeli in 1473. It was a hard fight, fought in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, but Mehmed won it, and the victory finally secured his eastern frontier against Turkic rivals who had been probing for weakness for years. With that threat neutralized, the Sultan could, for the first time in years, look at his empire as a whole and consider what came next. What came next was personal grief. Shehzadeh Mustafa, Mehmed's eldest and most capable son, died the year after Otlubeli. The prince had been carefully prepared for succession, educated, trained, positioned, and his death was a shock to the entire Ottoman government. Mehmed's grief, by all accounts, was real and deep, and it was followed almost immediately by something that revealed a great deal about the Sultan's character: rage. Mehmed blamed Mahmud Pasha, his grand vizier, for the prince's death. The historical record is not entirely clear on why or whether the accusation had any basis. What is clear is what happened next. Mahmud Pasha, a man who had served the empire loyally for over 2 decades, who had fought in campaigns across the Balkans and Anatolia, who had built the administrative machinery that made Ottoman expansion sustainable, was stripped of his titles, detained, and executed. It was a brutal act, and it was not lost on anyone watching. The Sultan, who had rebuilt Constantinople into an imperial capital, who had positioned himself as a ruler of law and learning as much as of war, had just executed his most senior official on what appeared to be a grief-driven accusation. The message it sent through the Ottoman court was not subtle. Loyalty, capability, and decades of service were not protections. The Sultan's mood was Mahmud Pasha's rival, Gedik Ahmed Pasha, rose to fill the vacancy as Grand Vizier in 1474. Whether he had played any role in engineering Mahmud's downfall is a question historians have debated without resolution. What we know is that he benefited from it, and that the court he now helped manage was one that had just been reminded of how quickly the ground shifts beneath the most powerful men in the empire. Meanwhile, along the western frontier, the situation in Albania continued to demand attention. Skanderbeg, the Albanian lord who had unified his country's nobility and held the Ottomans at bay for 25 years through a combination of brilliant tactics and carefully maintained alliances with Venice and other European powers, had died in 1468. His death had done what decades of Ottoman military effort had failed to do. It removed the organizing center of Albanian resistance. His son, John II Castrioti, was too young and too unknown to command the allegiance that Skanderbeg had built over a lifetime. Local resistance continued, supported fitfully by Venice through its strongholds at Shkodra, Durrës, and Lezhë, but it lacked the coherence that had made it so dangerous. In 1474, while Mehmed managed his gout and his grief from the imperial palace, he dispatched an army westward under Hadim Suleiman Pasha, the Rumelian Beylerbey, with orders to besiege Shkodra and cut off Venetian support for the Albanian resistance from the north. Suleiman marched with over 20,000 men, laid siege to the city by mid-May, and hammered its walls with Ottoman artillery. The walls crumbled. The garrison held anyway. In the final assault in August alone, the Ottoman force suffered 3,000 casualties. When news arrived that a Venetian relief fleet was approaching, Suleiman withdrew. It was not a disaster, but it was not a victory either. And Suleiman, instead of returning to the capital, received new orders from Mehmed before he had even finished regrouping. There was a new problem, bigger than Shkodra, bigger in some ways than Albania. The problem had a name, Stephen of Moldavia. Moldavia is not a name that appears often in the history books taught in Western schools, and that is a problem because the story of Moldavia in the 15th century is one of the most remarkable stories of political survival and military innovation in the entire medieval period. The Principality was founded in the mid-14th century, born out of the decline of Mongol power in Eastern Europe and the gradual weakening of Hungary's ability to control its eastern borders. Around 1345, a Vlach noble named Dragos of Maramuresh was sent by the Hungarian crown to establish a defensive march against Tatar incursions in the east. He succeeded, and the realm he created became the seed of Moldavian political identity. A generation later, his successors were expelled by Bogdan I, a rival voivode who rebelled against Hungarian authority and declared Moldavian independence around 1359. Under Bogdan and those who followed him, Moldavia developed its own institutions, its own military traditions, and its own dynasty. The territory was strategically significant in ways that guaranteed it would never be left alone. It stretched between the Carpathians and the Dniester River, controlling key trade routes that connected the Black Sea to the interior of Eastern Europe. That positioning made it valuable and made it contested. Hungary wanted it as a buffer. Poland wanted it as a client state. The Ottomans wanted its port towns of Ackerman and Kilia, which opened onto the Black Sea, and gave whoever held them influence over the entire regional trade network. Moldavia survived by navigating between these competing appetites with a combination of diplomacy, tribute, and occasional violence. It was not a comfortable existence, but it was an existence. By 1451, Bogdan II of Moldavia had been murdered and replaced by his brother, Peter III, who formalized Moldavia's position as a Polish vassal while continuing to pay annual tribute to the Ottomans. It was a careful, pragmatic arrangement that acknowledged the reality of Moldavia's position between great powers. It was also an arrangement that Bogdan II's son, a young man named Stephen, had no intention of accepting permanently. Stephen received support from John Hunyadi's Hungarian armies, and alongside his cousin Vlad III of Wallachia, a man who would acquire his own terrible reputation in time, reclaimed the Moldavian throne from his usurping relative in 1457. He was in his mid-20s when he took power, and he spent the first years of his reign doing something that most rulers of contested small states did not do well. He prepared. He reformed the army from the ground up. Moldavia already had a military tradition, but Stephen professionalized it, creating a standing force of mercenaries who could be deployed quickly and reliably, while simultaneously improving the system for mobilizing peasant levies from the countryside. He understood that his realm would never be able to match the raw numbers of its potential enemies, so he focused instead on flexibility, speed, and local knowledge, building an army that could respond rapidly, fight in terrain that disadvantaged larger forces, and sustain operations through conditions that would break a more conventionally organized military. He also curtailed the power of the Vlach nobility, the boyar class, that had historically been a source of instability and factional politics in Moldavia, as it had been throughout the region. New judicial codes and tax structures centralized authority in Suceava, the capital, and reduced the ability of powerful noble families to act as independent political actors. It was a delicate process. Push too hard on the nobility and you create enemies who can destabilize everything. But Stephen managed it with the kind of political intelligence that would define his entire reign. In 1462, Stephen made a move that demonstrated just how pragmatic he was willing to be. He supported Ottoman armies during their war against Wallachia, using the conflict to recapture the strategic port of Kilia. By 1465, Kilia was in Moldavian hands, giving Stephen control over the Danube Delta and a significant piece of the Black Sea trade. It was a classic small state maneuver. Align with the stronger power long enough to achieve your specific objective, then manage the consequences. The consequences came quickly. Observing that Moldavia was beginning to reassert itself as a regional force under this ambitious new ruler, Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, decided to reassert his own authority over his neighbor to the east. In 1467, he invaded with a substantial army. He was defeated at the Battle of Baia. This is worth pausing on because the Battle of Baia is one of those historical events that tells you almost everything you need to know about the man who won it. Matthias Corvinus was not an incompetent ruler. He was, by the standards of his time, an effective military commander with a professional army and considerably more resources than Stephen. He invaded Moldavia expecting the kind of resistance that a small principality could plausibly mount against a major kingdom. What he got was something else entirely. Stephen had prepared the battlefield, managed his supply lines, used the terrain and the winter conditions to neutralize Hungarian advantages, and struck with devastating effect. Matthias Corvinus lost up to 10,000 men and was personally wounded during the fighting. He withdrew. Stephen followed the victory by raiding Transylvania to make the point that victory was not just defensive. Then he repulsed a Golden Horde invasion at Lipnik. Then he managed an attempted coup by his exiled rival Peter III, backed by Radu III of Wallachia, and emerged from it with his throne intact and his enemies neutralized. By the early 1470s, Stephen III of Moldavia was one of the most battle-tested rulers in Eastern Europe, commanding a reformed military, a centralized state, and a reputation that even Mehmed II's court had begun to take seriously. The question was how long Stephen's carefully maintained balance could hold. The relationship between Mehmed II and Stephen III had never been simple. Moldavia's tributary status was a political arrangement, not a statement of genuine submission, and both men understood that. Stephen paid his annual tribute to the Sublime Porte when it served his interests and found reasons to delay when it did not. Mehmed accepted tribute when it came, and issued reminders when it did not. It was a transactional relationship built on mutual recognition of the other's capability, and it functioned well enough as long as neither side pushed it to a breaking point. Kilia was the breaking point. When Stephen captured Kilia from Wallachia in 1465, he had done so with a degree of Ottoman acquiescence. Moldavian and Ottoman interests had aligned at that particular moment against Wallachia, and Mehmed had been willing to let the port change hands. But as the years passed, Mehmed's strategic thinking shifted. Kilia was too valuable to leave in Moldavian hands. It was not just a trading post, it was an entry point into the Black Sea commercial network, and the Black Sea was increasingly central to Ottoman economic and strategic planning. Mehmed wanted Kilia returned to Wallachian control, specifically to the control of a Wallachian ruler he could rely on. Radu III of Wallachia, known as Radu the Handsome, and yes, the younger brother of Vlad the Impaler, was Mehmed's preferred partner in Wallachia. Radu was genuinely and consistently pro-Ottoman, which, in the volatile politics of Wallachia in the 1470s, made him almost uniquely useful to the Sublime Porte. The problem was that Wallachian politics were exactly as volatile as they always had been, and Radu's hold on his throne depended on a combination of Ottoman support and the shifting allegiances of a boyar class that measured loyalty in terms of immediate advantage. Stephen understood all of this, and in the fall of 1473, while Ottoman armies were occupied in Anatolia against Uzun Hasan and therefore unable to respond immediately, he made his move. He invaded Wallachia, defeated Radu III in battle, and installed Basarab III, a Danished relative, in his place. It was a direct challenge to Ottoman influence in a state that Mehmed regarded as firmly within his sphere. Mehmed's response came quickly. Mihalolu Ali Bey, one of the most effective Ottoman cavalry commanders in the Balkans, was sent with 17,000 Akinci raiders to restore Radu. The raiders devastated the local countryside as they moved, and by the end of the year, Radu was back on his throne. But the situation did not stabilize. By the spring of 1474, Basarab had regained power again with Moldavian backing. The back and forth continued, and every round of it deepened Mehmed's anger and reinforced his determination to resolve the Moldavian problem definitively. The ultimatum he sent Stephen in 1474 was not diplomatic language designed to open a negotiation. It was a statement of conditions: pay the annual tribute, appear before the Sultan in Constantinople to submit personally, surrender Kilia to the empire, all three conditions, immediately. Stephen's response arrived in Constantinople that summer. He refused all three. Every single condition refused, not negotiated, not partially accepted, not diplomatically deferred, refused outright. It was a statement that left no room for ambiguity about where things stood. Stephen of Moldavia was telling the most powerful ruler in his world that he would not submit, would not attend, would not surrender, and that if Mehmed wanted Kilia, he would have to come and take it himself. Official war was declared, and Hadim Suleiman Pasha, who had just finished a difficult and ultimately unsuccessful siege at Shkodra, received his new orders and began planning the march to Moldavia. Here is what made Stephen III different from most rulers who found themselves facing the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. Most rulers in his position spent their energy trying to avoid the war. They sought alliances, paid tribute, negotiated delays, hoped that circumstances would change, that the Ottomans would be distracted elsewhere, that the threat would somehow diminish before it arrived at their gates. Some of those strategies worked, temporarily. Most of them did not, and the rulers who pursued them spent years in a defensive crouch, reactive and dependent on events outside their control. Stephen did something different. When war became inevitable, and by the summer of 1474, it was inevitable, he stopped thinking about how to avoid it and started thinking about how to win it. His first decision was the most important one. He would not fight the war the Ottomans expected him to fight. He would not mass his army at the border and meet a numerically superior force in open battle. He would not defend his capital and wait for a siege. He would shape the conditions of the war so completely that by the time the Ottoman army actually engaged with his forces, It would already be exhausted, disoriented, undersupplied, and psychologically broken. He implemented a scorched earth policy of total commitment, not partial, not selective, total. Hundreds of villages across the likely paths of Ottoman advance were evacuated, their inhabitants relocated deeper into Moldavian territory. The buildings were burned, the wells were poisoned, the grain stores were destroyed or carried away. The roads, such as they were made impassable wherever possible. Stephen intended to present the Ottoman army with a country that offered nothing: no food, no shelter, no reliable water, no friendly population that might provide information or assistance. He also understood that scorched earth alone was not a strategy. It was a preparation. The strategy was to combine that preparation with constant harassment, hit-and-run attacks by light cavalry and infantry that would bleed the Ottoman column without ever offering a decisive engagement, forcing Suleiman's men to spend energy responding to threats that materialized and disappeared before they could be properly countered. It was the same approach his cousin Vlad had used against Ottoman forces in Wallachia years earlier, refined and adapted to Moldavian terrain. At the same time, Stephen was building his actual battle force because he understood that at some point the harassment and attrition would need to culminate in a decisive confrontation. He could not simply drain the Ottoman army indefinitely. He needed to destroy it, or enough of it to make continuing the war politically unacceptable for the Sublime Porte. He gathered approximately 20,000 troops for the campaign. Half of that number were from Moldavia itself, professional infantry, light and heavy boyar cavalry, and 20 cannons. The other half were foreign auxiliaries and mercenaries whose participation represented the success of Stephen's diplomatic outreach in the years leading up to the war. 5,000 Sekeli infantry came from Transylvania. 2,000 Polish cavalry arrived in response to Moldavia's existing relationship with the Polish crown. 1,800 Hungarian infantry, cavalry, and handgunners joined the force. 1,000 Wallachian volunteers, motivated by their own complicated relationship with Ottoman power, completed the coalition. 20,000 men against an Ottoman army that would ultimately field somewhere between 30 and 40,000 plus Wallachian reinforcements. But Stephen was not planning to fight on Ottoman terms. He was planning to fight on his. He had identified the location long before the Ottoman army crossed the Danube, the valley near Vaslui, where the Barlad River ran south through marshy, fog-prone terrain, with forest on the flanks and a single small wooden bridge as the only reliable crossing point in the area. He had studied it. He understood how its geography would function as a force multiplier for a smaller defending army, how the fog that accumulated in the valley in January would blind an advancing force, how the marshland on either side of the main path would channel the Ottoman advance into a narrow corridor where numbers became irrelevant, how the forest on the flanks would conceal troops until the exact moment they were needed. He built earthworks and trenches at the northern end of the marsh. He positioned his artillery where it could cover both the bridge and the approaches from the south. He placed his boyar cavalry, his best, most disciplined heavy horse, in the forest on the flank, hidden, ready, waiting for the signal that would only come when the trap had fully closed. And then he waited for the Ottomans to walk into his country. Before we continue, I want to pause here and ask you something directly. We are telling the story of a man who, against every reasonable expectation, refused to submit to the most powerful empire in his world and then built the conditions for an extraordinary victory. If you were in Stephen's position in 1474, if you ruled a small principality with limited resources, surrounded by powers that wanted to absorb or control you, what would you have done? Would you have found a way to negotiate, or would you have drawn the line? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think, and if you are watching without having subscribed yet, please consider doing that now. It helps this channel grow and allows us to keep telling stories like this one. Hadim Suleiman Pasha was a capable military administrator. That matters for understanding what happened at Vaslui, because his failure there was not the failure of an incompetent man. It was the failure of a capable man who was given an impossible task under terrible conditions and then made a series of decisions that, in the fog and pressure of actual events, seemed reasonable but were not. He spent the autumn of 1474 in Sofia, regrouping from the Shkodra campaign and assembling the force he would take north. The army he gathered numbered between 30 and 40,000, a substantial provincial force that included Azabs, the irregular infantry that typically formed the front lines of Ottoman engagements, Janissaries, the elite professional soldiers who were the most disciplined fighting force in the Ottoman world, Akinci light cavalry, skilled at raids and scouting, Tamarli Sipahi, the heavy cavalry who held land grants in exchange for military service, and a contingent of Bulgarian engineers tasked with managing roads and bridges along the route north. The timing was already problematic. The campaigning season in 15th century Eastern Europe effectively ended with the onset of winter. Armies did not march in January through frozen, snow-covered terrain by choice. They did it when they had to. Suleiman was marching in late November and December because Mehmed had ordered the campaign. The order had come late in the year, and there was no politically acceptable option of waiting for spring. He crossed the frozen Danube in 2 columns from Vidin and Nicopolis in November 1474. The crossing itself was manageable. The river was frozen solid enough to bear the weight of the army, but the conditions immediately north of the Danube were not manageable in any comfortable sense. The weather had already turned hard. Cold settled into the bones of the march. Progress slowed. Men who had campaigned across the Balkans and Anatolia found that the particular quality of winter in Wallachia and Moldavia was different from anything they had experienced. Wetter, foggier, with a cold that did not merely chill but seemed to penetrate the mind as well as the body. Recognizing that his army was struggling, Suleiman made a sensible decision. He stopped near Bucharest and rested his troops for more than 2 weeks, using the pause to receive the promised reinforcements from Basarab III of Wallachia. Those reinforcements numbered 10,000, a significant addition that brought the total Ottoman and Allied force to somewhere between 40 and 50,000 men. The rest helped, the Wallachian addition helped, but Suleiman had also spent those 2 weeks in territory that was technically friendly. When he crossed into Moldavia in December, he entered a different world entirely. The villages were empty. Not recently emptied, not the kind of abandonment you see when civilians flee from an approaching army at the last moment, leaving behind food on tables and fires still burning. These villages had been evacuated with time and intention. The buildings were shells, the wells had been treated, the grain stores were gone. Even the paths that should have served as roads seemed to fade and vanish, as though the land itself was refusing to cooperate with the invaders. For nearly a month, the Ottoman army marched north through this emptiness. Every step forward was a step into a landscape that offered nothing. Supply lines stretched back across the Danube with painful inadequacy. The cold was constant, and somewhere ahead, invisible and uncatchable, Moldavian light cavalry harassed the column's flanks and rear, cutting down stragglers, disrupting foraging parties, appearing and disappearing before any organized response could be mounted. Suleiman's men were not broken by this. They were, as described, hardened soldiers with genuine discipline and experience, but they were cold, they were hungry, they were tired, and they had been marching through a hostile country for weeks without the engagement that would at least provide the psychological release of decisive action. That combination, physical exhaustion combined with unresolved tension, is one of the most dangerous conditions an army can be in when it finally encounters a battle. On the 10th of January, 1475, Ottoman scouts spotted something they had not seen in weeks: intact villages. A cluster of them in a valley south of the town of Vaslui, where the Barlad River flowed through the land in a way that created shelter from the worst of the wind. There was food there was shelter, there was, after the nothing of the past month, something. Suleiman Pasha decided to rest his army in the valley before continuing north to Suceava. It was exactly the decision Stephen had planned for him to make. January 10th, 1475. The fog that morning was not unusual for that valley at that time of year. It came in from the river and from the marshland that flanked the main approaches, and it settled over the terrain like a physical substance, not just reducing visibility, but changing the quality of sound, muffling distances, making it impossible to judge where a noise was coming from or how far away it had originated. Suleiman's troops began moving toward the valley and the bridge that crossed the Barlad River. The bridge was the only reliable crossing point in the area. The river on either side of it ran through marshland that was navigable only with difficulty and danger. Moving an army of tens of thousands across such terrain without the bridge was possible in theory and catastrophic in practice. As the first Ottoman units began crossing the bridge and organizing on the western bank, the drums started. Moldavian war drums coming from the north, from directly ahead, where the valley narrowed and the marsh thickened and the fog was densest. The sound carried through the cold air with startling clarity, and it produced exactly the response Stephen had calculated it would produce. Suleiman, hearing the drums and believing that Stephen's entire army was arrayed ahead, ordered his forces forward. The reasoning was straightforward. The army was already crossing the bridge. They had found the enemy they needed to advance and engage before Stephen could maneuver away. Men crossed the bridge and moved north through the fog, pushing into the marsh. The Ottoman force organized into something resembling a battle formation as it moved, though the terrain made precise alignment impossible. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few dozen feet in any direction. The ground beneath their feet shifted from solid to soft as they moved deeper into the marshland, each step an uncertainty. What the Ottoman soldiers could not know, what the fog and the drums and the urgency of the moment had prevented them from assessing, was that they were being funneled. The marshland on either side of their line of advance was not passable by formed troops. The valley walls to either side channeled the entire Ottoman force into a corridor that grew narrower as it went north. And at the northern end of that corridor, behind earthworks and trenches that had been prepared over weeks, Stephen's regular army waited. When the first Ottoman units came close enough to the Moldavian defensive line, the contact was sudden and violent. Arrows came from multiple directions simultaneously, not just from the earthworks ahead, but from positions along the flanks that had been concealed until the moment of engagement. The fog prevented the Ottoman soldiers from locating the archers or understanding the geometry of what was happening to them. Men fell without being able to identify where the fire was coming from. The front Ottoman units pressed forward into the earthworks, and the fighting became the close, grinding, brutal work of hand-to-hand combat at fortified positions. Stephen's regular infantry, his Moldavian professionals alongside the Polish cavalry and Hungarian handgunners, held the line with the discipline of men who knew the terrain, knew the plan, and knew that the entire strategy depended on not giving ground at this moment. At the rear of the army, Suleiman Pasha could not see the front. He could hear it, the crash of weapons, the shouting, the drums still beating, but the fog and the distance and the chaos of 40,000 men in motion meant that his picture of what was happening was fragmentary and delayed. He received reports, but reports filtered through frightened messengers, and the confusion of battle are not reliable instruments for decision-making. He ordered a general advance. He ordered reinforcements to cross the bridge. This is the moment where Suleiman's decision-making, understandable under the circumstances, became catastrophic. As the Ottoman commander ordered his rear echelons forward, pushing them across the wooden bridge to reinforce the fighting at the front, Moldavian artillery opened fire from the opposite bank of the river. The cannon crews had waited for exactly this, for the bridge to be crowded with men and horses, and their timing was precise. Cannonballs hit the bridge and the approaches to it. Handgunners who had been positioned along the riverbank added their fire to the chaos. The bridge, a small wooden structure not designed to bear the weight of thousands of men and cavalry simultaneously, began to fail. The combination of overcrowding, artillery impacts, and the weight of armored cavalry being rushed across in response to Suleiman's orders caused it to collapse. Suddenly, the Ottoman army was divided by a river. On the northern bank, the forward elements were engaged in heavy fighting at the Moldavian earthworks, taking casualties, holding on through discipline rather than advantage. On the southern bank, the rest of the army, including much of the cavalry and the reserve formations that were supposed to provide the decisive weight of the assault, could no longer reach the battle. Men attempted to cross the river itself, wading through freezing water in January with their equipment and weapons. Some made it. Many did not complete the crossing in any condition to fight effectively. The cold water had its own way of ending a man's participation in a battle. And then the Wallachian contingent refused. Basarab III's cavalry, positioned at the rear and supposed to provide the final weight of the Ottoman push, looked at the collapsed bridge, the artillery fire, the confusion on both banks, and the freezing river, and declined to enter it. The precise sequence of what happened between the Wallachian commanders and the Ottoman officers in those moments is not fully documented, but what is documented is the result. A fierce confrontation between the two forces mid-battle over whether the Wallachians would advance. The argument escalated. Basarab, facing demands he had no intention of meeting under those conditions, pulled his force out of the battle entirely. 10,000 cavalry gone. At the front of the fighting, things were developing with a momentum that the Ottoman commanders there could not fully understand or respond to. The Sipahi heavy cavalry had managed to push back the left wing of Stephen's line, the Sekeli infantry and some of the Moldavian professionals, and for a moment it seemed as though the superior Ottoman fighting weight might create the breakthrough that the battle's chaos had otherwise prevented. It lured them forward. From the forest to the left of the Ottoman line, Moldavian war drums began to sound, a second position, a flanking threat. Ottoman officers already managing a chaotic situation on uncertain terrain with their commander cut off at the rear and their right flank missing its promised cavalry, shifted to meet it. They began organizing a secondary defensive line to face the new threat from the forest. The new threat from the forest was a diversion. Stephen's heavy boyar cavalry, his finest soldiers, held in reserve throughout the entire battle behind a forested hill to the right of the Ottoman line, received the signal. They came out of the trees at full charge, striking the right flank and rear of the Ottoman force at exactly the moment when Ottoman attention had been pulled in the opposite direction. The collision was total. The Ottoman soldiers at the front were already exhausted, already confused, already managing the cognitive overload of fighting in fog on marshy terrain with their supply of reinforcements cut off behind a collapsed bridge. When the boyar cavalry hit from a direction they had not anticipated, with a force they had not seen assembling, the psychological impact exceeded the physical one. The thought that gripped the Ottoman ranks, impossible to trace to any single soldier but impossible to misidentify in what followed, was that they were surrounded. From the front, from the left, now from the right and rear. They were not surrounded. Stephen did not have enough men to encircle an army of that size. But in fog, in exhaustion, in the particular terror of a battle going catastrophically wrong, the sensation of encirclement is indistinguishable from the reality of it, and the effect on behavior is identical. The Ottoman army broke, not one unit, not the weaker formations at the edges. The entire army in a matter of minutes went from fighting force to rout. Individual units fled in every direction. Officers trying to halt the collapse found themselves alone. The discipline that had held through weeks of difficult march and hours of confused battle dissolved in a moment that everyone present recognized as final. The retreat lasted 3 days. For 3 days, Moldavian cavalry pursued the remnants of Suleiman's army across the frozen landscape, running down men who were too tired and too cold and too shocked to organize effective resistance. Ottoman officers were captured as they tried to manage what little remained of their formations. Most were executed. The battlefield and the roads leading south became, in the words of accounts that survive from multiple sources, a landscape of unimaginable loss. The Ottoman Empire suffered up to 20,000 casualties at Vaslui. Stephen's losses were approximately 5,000. Suleiman Pasha escaped. He returned to Sofia with what remained of his army and began the process of reporting to a sultan who had sent him to conquer Moldavia and was about to learn what had happened instead. The Battle of Vaslui was over. The news traveled faster than such news usually traveled in the 15th century because everyone who received it found it almost too significant to keep. Stephen wrote to every Christian court in Europe with the details of the victory. He sent the captured Ottoman battle standards to Pope Sixtus IV in Rome. He listed the names of the enemy commanders taken or killed. He described the losses inflicted on the Ottoman force with the precision of a man who understood that military credibility is also political capital, and that the political value of Vaslui depended on the European courts understanding its full scale. Sixtus IV responded by awarding Stephen III of Moldavia the title of Athleta Christi, Champion of Christ. It was the same honor previously given to John Hunyadi and Skanderbeg, men who had built their reputations over decades of anti-Ottoman resistance. Stephen had earned it in a single battle on a January morning in a fog-covered marsh. The diplomatic correspondence that followed was, from Stephen's perspective, deeply frustrating. He had just demonstrated what a determined, well-prepared, smaller force could do against the Ottoman military. He had bought time, real time, strategic time, for any coalition of Christian powers willing to use it. He wrote to Hungary, to Poland, to Venice, to Rome, making the argument directly, now, while the Ottomans are recovering from this defeat, is the moment to coordinate a response that could genuinely alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The response he received was sympathetic, admiring, and largely non-committal. Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had his own complicated relationship with Stephen and was simultaneously managing a campaign in Bohemia, pledged support but moved slowly. Poland's involvement remained limited. Venice was interested but unwilling to commit resources beyond what it was already deploying to protect its Adriatic territories. The crusade that might have followed Vaslui did not materialize, and Stephen, who had risked everything to create the conditions for it, was left to prepare for Mehmed's inevitable personal response. While the courts of Europe debated, the Ottoman marcher lords in the Balkans continued their work. Mihalolu Ali Bey had raided into Hungary in 1474, reaching as far as Oradea and enslaving thousands of people during his march through the country. Turkish raiders from Bosnia had extended into Croatia, striking Varaždin and other towns. By the time of Vaslui, Ottoman cavalry had penetrated into Carniola and Carinthia, producing genuine panic in the courts of Vienna and Budapest. Matthias Corvinus finally moved to direct action by the scale of the raids into his own territory, gathered 10,000 men and marched on Shabak, a recently constructed Ottoman fortress on the Sava River that had been serving as a staging point for raids northward. The siege began in late 1475 and was prosecuted with assistance from Vuk Gregorović, the Serbian despot who held his title nominally and his ambitions rather more seriously. After 30 days, Shabak fell. The loss of the fortress temporarily disrupted Ottoman raiding operations across the Danube near Belgrade. In the weeks that followed, Hungarian forces raided into Ottoman-controlled Bosnia and Serbia. Among the men fighting in those raids was Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, who had spent years imprisoned in Hungary after his removal from the Wallachian throne in 1462 and had recently been released by Matthias to serve in exactly this capacity. In the forests of Bosnia and Serbia, Vlad did what Vlad did. The accounts from those weeks are not pleasant reading, even by the standards of 15th century warfare. The Ottoman marcher lords retaliated throughout 1476, sending raids into the Banat of Temesvar, into Croatia and Slovenia, sacking towns and villages as far west as Ljubljana, and reaching as far as Tarvisio in what is now northeastern Italy. The raids were devastating enough that when Matthias Corvinus's new bride, Princess Beatrice of Naples, traveled north to meet her future husband, she navigated her journey through a landscape of burned villages and bodies. Not quite the royal welcome one might have hoped for. Europe had seen what Stephen could do at Vaslui. It had not found the collective will to build on it. And Mehmed II was not waiting any longer. In the spring of 1476, Sultan Mehmed II ended his convalescence from gout, reviewed what had happened at Vaslui with the complete and organized information of a commander who had not been present at the disaster, and began planning his personal campaign against Moldavia. He was not angry in the way that produces poor decisions. He was angry in the way that produces very precise ones. He had lost 20,000 men to a Moldavian force half the size of his own in terrain his commander had failed to adequately assess, against an enemy whose tactics his army had not been prepared to counter. He understood each of those failures specifically. He was not going to repeat them. He assembled 40,000 men in Sofia. his personal force, which included units that had fought at Constantinople and the best of his Janissary formations. He marched not along the direct route through Wallachia, which would have been faster but offered the same terrain advantages to the defenders, but along the Black Sea coast, a longer but more manageable approach that kept his supply lines functional and his army in better condition for the actual campaign. He crossed the Danube in early summer, and the crossing itself took over 3 days, a reflection of the size of the force he had brought. He also coordinated with his Tatar allies in Crimea, arranging for the Crimean Khanate to invade Moldavia from the east simultaneously, opening a second front that would force Stephen to divide his forces. It was a sensible plan. It might have worked. Stephen moved first against the Tatars near Ackerman and defeated them before they could penetrate deeply enough to cause the kind of disruption Mehmed had intended. The Tatars were pushed out of Moldavia entirely. The second front closed before it properly opened. Stephen then returned to his core strategy: scorched earth, harassment, attrition, waiting for the conditions to fight on ground of his choosing. But Mehmed had studied Vaslui carefully. He did not advance carelessly. He maintained his supply lines with deliberate attention. He moved his army in formations that protected against flank attack. He sent scouts ahead in organized patterns rather than relying on the kind of ad hoc scouting that had led Suleiman's men into the fog at the Barlad Bridge. He was slower than he might otherwise have been, and that slowness was the point. He was not going to be hunted. As the Ottoman army advanced towards Suceava through a region called the White Valley, Valea Alba, it encountered Stephen's force of approximately 12,000 men. The Moldavian ruler did not have the foreign reinforcements he had at Vaslui. Poland and Hungary had not provided the troop commitments they had in the previous year. He was fighting with what Moldavia itself could field, and 12,000 against 40,000, even with terrain advantages, was a different calculation than 20,000 against 30. The Ottoman vanguard, led once again by Hadim Suleiman Pasha, who had been given the chance to redeem himself, which says something about Mehmed's pragmatism, if not his sentimentality, advanced through wooded terrain and was ambushed by Moldavian forces who struck with the speed and precision that had characterized Stephen's operations throughout the war. The vanguard took heavy losses. Only the arrival of the main Ottoman army prevented a complete disaster, forcing Stephen to break off the attack and retreat to a prepared defensive position behind a line of forest. Stephen set up his defensive line and waited. Mehmed ordered a general advance. The forest through which the Ottoman army passed was set ablaze by Moldavian soldiers. The fire moved faster than the Ottoman formations could reorganize to escape it, and casualties were significant and chaotic. While the army struggled through the burning trees, Moldavian handgunners and artillery opened fire from prepared positions ahead, adding to the disorder. It was at this point that Mehmed did something that made the difference. He came to the front himself. The Sultan rode into the chaos of his burning, confused, frightened army, and did what great commanders in moments of crisis sometimes manage to do. He made the men around him feel that the situation was not, in fact, lost. He found his Janissary commanders and rallied them. He gave orders that cut through the panic with the authority of a man who has spent 30 years never losing a war. He personally commanded. The Ottoman army, which had been on the edge of another catastrophic rout, steadied. The pressure on all sides of Stephen's position increased beyond what his smaller force could sustain. He had inflicted real damage, between 5,000 and 10,000 Ottoman casualties by most estimates, compared to perhaps 1,000 Moldavian dead, but he could not hold his line against a force that had recovered its cohesion and now held numerical advantages on every front. He ordered a retreat, pulling his army north toward the Polish border, where he could reassemble and potentially receive the reinforcements that had not come in time for this battle. Mehmed had won. It had cost him significantly, but he had won. He could not press the victory. The plague that had been moving through the Moldavian countryside during the campaign now reached his army. His casualties from the battle and the march had reduced his effective strength. The major fortresses of the region, Pairedi, Kilia, Ackerman, Targu Neamț, had not fallen. Without those positions, the conquest of Moldavia was not a conquest, but an expensive march through a ruined country. He burned what remained of the Moldavian countryside as his army turned south. It was not a strategic act at that point. It was a statement, a demonstration that the cost of defiance was total devastation, even if it was not subjugation. Stephen returned from the Polish border to a realm that was, in large parts, ash. His realm was still his. The Ottomans were gone. Wallachia, meanwhile, changed hands again. Matthias Corvinus sent Stephen III of Transylvania with a Moldavian force to reinstall Vlad Dracula on the Wallachian throne in the fall of 1476. Basarab III lost his throne once more, but the volatility of Wallachian politics produced one final twist. By early 1477, Basarab had regained power with Ottoman support. During the struggle, Vlad III was cornered near Snagov and killed, his head taken by Turkish agents and sent to Constantinople, where it was displayed as Mehmed II saw fit. 15 years of terror, survival, and legend ended with a head on a stake in an imperial capital. It was a significant symbolic moment for Mehmed, even if the strategic situation in Wallachia remained as complicated as it had always been. Stephen III of Moldavia ruled for another 28 years after Vaslui, dying in 1504. He fought 36 battles over the course of his reign and is said to have lost only 2. He built churches and monasteries across Moldavia, many of them still standing, some of them recognized today as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. He was canonized as a saint by the Romanian Orthodox Church. He is, in Romania, one of the most celebrated historical figures of the medieval period. And outside of Romania, and to a lesser degree Poland and a few other countries with a specific connection to Eastern European medieval history, he is almost completely unknown. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The Battle of Vaslui was, by any objective measure, one of the most extraordinary military victories of the 15th century. A smaller, less resourced force, defending a small principality against the most powerful empire of its age, not only defeated a major Ottoman army, but devastated it, inflicting casualties that would have been considered catastrophic in any engagement of that era against soldiers who had fought at Constantinople and across the entire Balkans. The battle demonstrated principles of asymmetric warfare, terrain exploitation, psychological preparation, and coalition building that military historians have analyzed and admired in other more famous contexts. It did not change the strategic balance permanently. Moldavia survived Mehmed's retaliatory campaign, but barely, and the damage to the country was severe. The European coalition that Vaslui should have catalyzed never fully formed. Ottoman expansion into the Balkans continued. The empire Mehmed built outlasted him by centuries. But Vaslui mattered. It mattered because it happened, because a small principality looked at an ultimatum from the most powerful ruler in its world and refused it, and then backed that refusal with one of the most effectively planned battles of the century. It mattered because it demonstrated that the Ottoman military, formidable as it was not invincible, that its vulnerabilities were real and could be exploited by a commander willing to think carefully about terrain, timing, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. And it mattered because Stephen's refusal, that summer of 1474, that staggering answer to Mehmed's ultimatum, was a statement about what a people are willing to pay to remain themselves. The cost of it was immense. The devastation of 1476 left Moldavia ruined in ways that took generations to recover from. Stephen paid personally in years of warfare and the constant pressure of survival in a way that most rulers who send armies to fight never quite pay. He thought it was worth it. History looking back suggests he was right. Not because Moldavia became a great power, not because the Ottomans were defeated, but because the principality survived with its identity intact, its institutions functioning, and its people's sense of themselves as something more than a conquered province of a distant empire. That survival is not a small thing. In the 15th century, with the Ottoman Empire doing what it was doing to the states around it, survival with independence was an extraordinary achievement. The world has not always told this story the way it deserves to be told. Today we try to tell it better. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Stephen III was given a choice in 1474. Submit pay the tribute, attend in person, surrender Kilia, and preserve his realm in a diminished but survivable form, or refuse and face the full weight of the Ottoman military with limited allies, limited resources, and the near certainty that even a successful defense would result in devastating retaliation. He refused, and the refusal cost his people enormously. Villages burned, fields destroyed, thousands of lives lost across years of warfare. The Moldavia that survived Mehmed's 1476 campaign was not the Moldavia that had existed before the war began. Was he right to refuse? That is not a question with a simple answer, and I do not think it should be. But it is a question worth asking, because versions of it appear throughout history in different centuries, in different languages, in different circumstances, wherever a people or a leader faces the decision between a diminished safety and a costly defiance. The weight of that choice does not become lighter with distance. Tell me what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to read your perspective on it. If this story moved you or made you think or made you want to know more, please like this video. It takes 1 second and it helps this story reach people who would want to hear it. Share it with someone who loves history or with someone who doesn't think they do yet. Subscribe if you haven't so you don't miss what comes next. We will keep telling stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for watching.